Is there any research out there that shows what the absolute best and most effective way to study a book is, or like what's going to get the most information into your head?
So this is actually a good question, because when the kind of default assumption when we're reading, and especially when we go to speed reading, is that, well, I'm getting everything from the book, I just don't do it fast enough, right? That's sort of the default assumption. Whereas sort of all the research that I've done on learning and this kind of stuff kind of points to the opposite, that even when we're reading things the normal way, we don't actually retain that much or remember that much or have it parsed in a very deep way. And so I think there's lots of different ways that you can approach studying a book depending on kind of what your goals are and how you're wanting to go through it. But I think one of the really sort of very basic techniques, which is shown to be quite effective, is what's called retrieval practice. So there's actually this really cute study that was done by Jeffrey Karpicki and Janelle Blunt, where they got students to study a text. So they're reading something, and then they had to answer some questions about it. And they got them to study it in different ways. So one group, they said, read it once, and then you're gonna do the test. Other group, you're gonna do repeated rereading. So you just read it, and then you read it over and over and over again. And this is very similar to how I think most people would process textual information. So maybe you read it, and then you have your notes, and you read over your notes. But it's primarily the same kind of activity. You're just reading it over and over again. Another group, they got to do a concept map. I don't know if you or your readers have heard of concept mapping before, but the basic idea is you draw like a concept and you have arrows pointing out to nodes of different concepts. And so the idea here is that we're going to connect all the ideas in the text together. Finally, they got people to do what they call free recall practice, which is where you read it, you shut the book, so you only read it once, and then you just try without any prompt to remember as much as you can from the text. And it's really interesting because they asked the students before they did the test, how well do you think you learned the information in the text? And those who did repeated rereading, those who read it over and over again, gave themselves the highest marks. They thought they really, really understood the text. They were the ones who are the most confident. However, if you do the actual test, you find that they don't do so well. And in contrast, those who thought they learned it really poorly were the free recall group. They're like, oh my God, I don't remember anything from this. When they're trying to do free recall, they did the best on the test. And so this shows that our kind of intuitions about how we're remembering and retrieving information are kind of faulty. And so one of the ideas here by a researcher, I think it's Robert Bjork, I'm maybe forgetting his first name, but he had this idea of what's we call judgments of learning, or basically that we decide how much we've learned based on how easy it feels to us. So if it feels really easy, then we think we've learned a lot. We've got a lot in memory. Now, where this kind of comes into play is that if you read something over and over and over again, it feels easier and easier. It becomes more and more familiar. But being familiar doesn't mean that you can actually recall it from memory. It doesn't mean that it's actually been stored in a way that you can access from a question or something. And so this leads to this phenomenon students have where they studied so much, and then they get to the test, and they're like, well, it was those questions the professor was asking. They were asking the wrong questions. I knew all that information, but they was asking these weird questions, and I couldn't get it. No, it's because you were very familiar with the information, but you weren't able to actually recall it to sum it up from memory. So this may sound like an academic concern. Maybe you're not studying for a test. Maybe you don't care. But what I would suggest is that the main reason we read books is for retrieval. The main reason we're reading it is not so that when we read it 5 times later, it feels more familiar to us. The main reason is so that when we're in some other situation, we're like, remember what this book said about that? And so I think retrieval practice should probably become a much larger part of our ongoing reading efforts. And there's a few simple ways you can do this. One simple way is just have a few sheets of loose leaf. Whenever you finish a chapter, just write down what was in the chapter you just read, and just a summary, some notes. Don't look at the chapter. You're not going back and trying to find right, and then they talked about this, and then that's transcribing, that's copying down. That's not what I'm talking about. It's trying to recall it from memory. Now, if you're actually studying something, so you mentioned studying a book, if you had a book here, reading Meditations or something like this, and you really want to know it, then you might want to do delayed retrieval practice. You might want to wait a day or two. So when you pick up the book the second time, it's been a couple days. What was in the last reading? That's a good time to do that, because spaced retrieval practice is even better than doing it right after, because then it's actually harder. It's harder to know what's in it, and that really strains those muscles, but you will also really internalize it much, much better. Now, there's ways you can go even beyond this. You can do flashcards, you could do self-testing, you could do kind of explainers. One thing I like to do for books that I find are really important is I like to write essays about them. So if you write an essay, then you're going to really internalize the concepts, because even if you have to look up some of the stuff, you have to kind of organize it at a high level, which maybe is not in the text at all. So these are all ways of processing the information, doing something with it, retrieving it, that quite frankly, most people don't do for any books they read. And I think if you don't have to do it for every book. I don't want to make it sound like every single book you've got these huge homework assignments. But if you understand that the default read through of a book is actually going to just leave a lot of it on the floor, and you feel that a book that you're reading is that important, then doing some kind of retrieval practice is probably helpful.